Shabbat Shalom. So, Rabbi David Hartman, who died about 8 or 10 years ago, Rabbi Hartman was an American Orthodox rabbi, grew up in the Bronx, I think. If you ever heard him speak, you know definitely New York City, but I think the Bronx. But he was the rabbi of the largest Orthodox shul in Montreal, and then after the Six-Day War, made Aliyah. And he established the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, and some of us have participated in various courses or lectures that they provide. And Rabbi Hartman told this story about this Jewish guy was sitting in a tavern in Tsarist Russia, and he was sitting with his non-Jewish, if not friend, at least acquaintance, and as Russians will, he was drinking more and more and more. And finally, the Russian said to his Jewish companion, you people think that we hate you. And we do hate you. Do you know why we hate you? We hate you because you think that you're better and more moral than we are. And the Jewish guy said, we are more moral than you. After all, we don't hunt. And the Gentile Russian said, of course you don't hunt. We don't allow you to own guns, right? So the Jewish guy got up and he called a meeting of all the Jewish intellectuals in the town, and he said, we're moving to Eretz Yisrael. Why do you want us to move to Eretz Yisrael? Because in Eretz Yisrael, it will be possible for us to prove that we can own guns and not hunt. Okay, and last week in my Drasha, I spoke about the contemporary, the most important moral challenge of Judaism in our day being the ethical use of power, right? And I really got that from Rabbi Hartman. I mean, Hartman was really the one thinker who stressed that the ethical use of power was what determined our morality as a people. And it's precisely why Hartman was, on the one hand, a very strong and vigorous Zionist. I mean, it wasn't actually until Rabbi Hartman passed away that the Hartman Institute started doing programs in the United States. I mean, up until that point, if you wanted to study Hartman, you had to do it in Jerusalem, right? But Hartman was a very strong Zionist, but he was also a very strong critique of the way Israel used power. And his son, Daniel Hartman, who runs the Hartman Institute now, follows in his footsteps. And Rabbi Hartman, David Hartman, wrote something about Pesach that I think is worth sharing. He wrote, as the festival of Passover draws nearer, the streets of Jerusalem where I live are filled with signs of joyful aspirations and preparation for a major spiritual event in the lives of the Jewish people. Supermarket shelves are lined with ever-increasing varieties of matzah, Families spend the weeks leading up to Passover washing the drapes, the linens. I wonder how they could be not kosher for Pesach. I never saw the drapes in my house eating bread. The floors, even rewashing loads of laundry. Everyone talks about cleaning, recipes, and kashrut. Do you follow the Ashkenazi custom of not eating kitniot, or do you follow the Sephardi custom? Must you eat shmura matzah to fulfill the mitzvah on Seder night? And exactly how much matzah must you eat to fulfill the mitzvah? As much as I am happy to be part of the Jewish people preparing for the holiday of Passover, I confess that I am bored by the atmosphere and the questions. I am bored by the kinds of conversations I hear around me, by a level of discourse that doesn't seem to get beyond an excessive concern with the minutiae of halachic ritual. He wrote that he wishes that Passover would be more than spring cleaning, that we would at least attempt to take the notions of oppression and freedom seriously and examine how they were reflected in our lived reality. But what do we talk about instead? In place of a holiday about values, Passover has become a holiday about recipes. The discourse has become overtaken by rabbis who have to make a living on kashrut. Okay, and I confess that I'm probably guilty of the same thing that Hartman criticizes. I mean, when I write to you information about Pesach, it's really mostly about how to keep kosher, how to sell your chametz, the siyum for the firstborn. It's very little about the spirituality of the holiday. I mean, it is, and I think sometimes it's because, two things. One is that the task of preparing for Pesach becomes like overwhelming, right? And the other thing is that, I'm aware of this, that there are plenty of people in our congregation who don't keep kosher throughout the year and are not necessarily very punctilious in their ritual observance. But when it comes to Pesach, they are. Okay, so if I don't keep kosher 365 days of the year, at least I'll keep kosher for 8 days a year. And so, whereas I don't get that many questions about regular year-round kashrut, I do get more questions about Pesach kashrut. There is a certain lack. I mean, the question is, can we find spirituality in the preparations dealing with kashrut? And, one of the things that Hartman criticized is that, there are no chaplains in the Israeli military. Okay, now you have the institution of the Rav Tzva'i, the military rabbi, but what does the Rav Tzva'i deal with? Mostly enforcing kashrut, all right, because the army is kosher. Okay, and I read a story a few weeks ago about 2 soldiers who were thrown in jail, army jail, which I imagine is not a fun place, right? They were thrown into army jail for 30 days for cooking on Shabbat, okay? Because not allowed, I mean, right, the army's kosher, the army observes Shabbat, right? And you don't have, I mean, you do now have chaplains in some Israeli hospitals, and the institution which is called in Hebrew Livui Ruchani, spiritual accompaniment. Why? Because you have also the Rav of the hospital. What is the job of the Rav of the hospital? Kashrut and Shabbat, not spiritual accompaniment, right? And question is, can we find spirituality in these Pesach preparations? And I think the answer is, I mean, look, some people really do find meaning in it. I mean, I had a congregant in Norwich, my previous congregation, and she was a convert to Judaism, and interestingly enough, her first husband was an Episcopalian bishop, and then they got divorced, and she married a Jewish guy and became Jewish, and she said, I have so much fun with my aluminum foil before this, right? And if you have fun with it, that's great, but I have to say that for me, we really do less and less every year. I mean, because it is, frankly, overwhelming, right? And if you are so frazzled and so worn out by the time that Pesach comes, it's hard to really, understand or appreciate the spirituality of Pesach, because you feel more like a slave than like a free person, right? But we have the institution of Mechirat Hametz, right? Selling Hametz. And again, I know because I see the list of people who sign up for it, right? And I know that not everybody on that list keeps kosher year round, but for Pesach, it's important. And I told this story before, but I think of it every Pesach, okay? And I spent a year living at a Trappist monastery in Northern California. And I also went every other weekend to Reno, Nevada, which is about 3 hours away. They were between rabbis, and I was their very part-time interim rabbi. So I had to handle the sale of chametz, right? And there was a monk at the monastery, Father Mark was his name, and he had a master's degree in biblical studies from the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome. The Trappist had sent him to study in Rome, and he knew Hebrew. He knew Hebrew fairly well, but he had only studied the Bible. He had never studied any post-biblical rabbinic texts. So he wanted to study Mishnah with me. So we studied all of the tractate Brachot, dealing with the laws of prayers, and then we started in on Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. And so as Pesach was coming, I explained to him the institution of Mechirat Hametz, and would Father Mark buy the Hametz of the conservative Jews of Reno, and he said that he would. Okay, now, the food at the monastery was vegetarian, so year-round it was fine, but I knew there was no way that I could observe Pesach there, so I arranged to spend Pesach in Los Angeles with friends. Now, California is a big state, right? Excuse me. And from the monastery to LA, about 500 miles. So I left the day before Pesach. Right, and I went to find Father Mark so he could sign the documents. And he says to me, can't do it. Can't do it, why not? And he said, well, I've been studying Mishnah with you, and I'm learning to think like a rabbi. And as a monk, I have a vow of poverty. What does a vow of poverty mean? It means I can't own property, right? So it occurs to me that if I buy the chametz, it's not a valid sale because I'm not allowed to own property. And I'm like, I'm glad I taught you to think like a rabbi, right? But now I have a problem on my hands, right? And he says, well, maybe you could sell it to the abbot. Okay, now what's the difference between selling it to a regular monk and selling it to the abbot? Is that, okay, so no individual monk owns property, but the monastery owns property, right? I mean, it owns the monastery, right? And it owns the tractors, and it owns the pickup trucks, and it owns the orchard, right? So maybe the abbot would buy it on behalf of the monastery. But I don't know where the abbot is. And they didn't have cell phones, right? So, all right, what am I gonna do? But if you do the form, right, it's the same form that I've used every year. It says that as your agent, I have the right to appoint another agent, right? So I called the rabbi in Sacramento, and I explained the situation to him, and I faxed him some paperwork, and that took care of it, right? But it wasn't until many years later that I really understood what was Father Mark's concern, right? And it was not per se for the integrity of his family. Right? It was that if he bought the chametz and it's not a valid sale, right, then you still own the chametz, right? He's concerned not for his religious observance, but for our religious observance, right? I don't want to be right. There's this mitzvah, lifnei iver lo titen michshol, right? Don't place a stumbling block before the blind, and I could be the stumbling block, and all these Jews will still own chametz during Pesach, and I have caused them to sin, and that was really his concern, right? And it's such a beautiful thing. I mean, it was a pain, but it's such a beautiful thing, right? Because he, as a religious Catholic, wanted to make sure that Jews could observe their mitzvot properly, right? And, at the end of the Aleinu, what do we say? V'ne'emar v'hayat Adonai l'melech kol haaretz, right? God will be the ruler of all the earth. V'ne'emar v'hayat kol haaretz u'shemo echad, right? U'shemo echad. God's name will be v'yom hachu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad. On that day, Adonai will be one and his name one, right? It doesn't mean that everybody will be Jewish, right? It means that we'll live in harmony and we'll each worship God in our own way, right? And that is Me'ein Olam Haba. It's a taste of the Messianic age, right? And that's the theme of Pesach, right? We have the Kosh Shel Eliyahu, right? That Elijah will usher in the Messianic era, and Hasidim have on day 8 of Pesach, Seudat Mashiach, right? The Messiah's meal, right? To emphasize even more. And so what Hartman writes is that messianic aspiration and hope should act as a normative critique of the status quo in history. Messianism takes us beyond the given and creates hope for new human potential in history. It is not a predictive moment in history, but a religious aspiration to redo history in the image of peace and love. It is the mission of these holy days to create conditions within human beings for their personal fulfillment. It is the purpose of the holidays to wake us up to our true capacities, to release the deeper ethical components of what it means to be a human being, right? So we have to try and keep alive the ethical implications of the Haggadah. If we understand and internalize the true message of Passover, we can develop a whole new response to those without power and take seriously the opportunity to love the stranger as yourself. Shabbat Shalom. And we continue with the Kaddish before Musaf and the Musaf service, page 155 or 428. And we'll say the first 2 pages of the